He was born free, under the golden sun of Jufure, Gambia, with laughter in his veins and the rhythm of his ancestors guiding every step. But freedom, as Kunta Kinte would soon learn, was a fragile thing, easily stolen, brutally taken, and violently erased. His story is not just one of suffering, it is the echo of millions whose voices were silenced, whose lives were commodified, and whose heritage was almost obliterated. This is the story America never wanted told, the true journey of Kunta Kinte, the African boy who became a slave, and the man whose spirit refused to be broken. Born into a tight-knit village, Kunta's childhood was filled with the warmth of family, the songs of elders, and the teachings of generations. Every morning, the call to prayer, the rustle of palm trees, and the laughter of his siblings reminded him of his place, in a world that valued life, community, and tradition. He learned the ways of his people, how to fish in the river, hunt in the forests, and honor the spirits of his ancestors. In his village, he was not just a boy, he was the embodiment of his lineage, carrying the hopes and dreams of those who came before him. But the world beyond Jufure was ruthless and indifferent to the innocence of childhood. One fateful day, the serenity of Kunta's life was shattered when slave traders descended upon his village, armed with chains, violence, and greed. The laughter of his youth turned to screams of terror as he was torn from everything familiar. The kidnapping of Kunta Kinte was not an isolated event. It was part of a sprawling network of human suffering. The transatlantic slave trade, which uprooted millions from their homes, erased their identities, and sold them as property to a world driven by profit. The Middle Passage was a nightmare that tested the limits of human endurance. Packed like cargo into the holds of slave ships, Kunta and countless others faced unimaginable horrors, disease, starvation, abuse, and the constant shadow of death. Yet even in the darkest moments, Kunta's mind clung to the memory of his village, to the voices of his family, and to the land where freedom had once embraced him. This mental defiance was the first act of resistance in a life that would demand courage at every turn. When he arrived in America, the new chains were not only physical but also cultural and psychological. Stripped of his name, Kunta Kinte was forced to adopt a foreign identity, to obey masters who saw him as property, and to abandon the heritage that had defined him. Yet beneath the surface, his spirit remained unbroken. He resisted in small but defiant ways, holding on to his African language, teaching his children the songs of his homeland, and refusing to let the brutal machinery of slavery erase his identity completely. Kunta Kinte's story is more than history. It is a mirror reflecting the cruel truths many have tried to forget. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable suffering, dignity, memory, and resistance can endure. Through his journey, we confront the raw reality of slavery, the heartbreak, the injustice, and the indomitable courage of those who survived it. This is the story that must be remembered, not hidden, for it is the story of freedom stolen and fought for, of humanity tested and yet undefeated. Kunta Kinte was born in the small, sun-drenched village of Jufure, located along the banks of the Gambia River in West Africa, a place where the rhythm of life moved in harmony with the land, the river, and the traditions of his ancestors. The village was a mosaic of families bound together by shared history, rituals, and respect for the elders whose wisdom guided daily life. Kunta's family, though not wealthy, carried pride and honor in their lineage. His father, Omoro, was a respected warrior and a man of great courage, whose eyes reflected both the weight of responsibility and the fierce love he bore for his people. His mother, Binta, nurtured him with tenderness and strength, teaching him the stories of their ancestors, the sacred chants, and the knowledge that would ground him in identity. The bond with his siblings was deep. They played together in the red earth and along the riverbanks, learning the ways of their people while laughing and dreaming freely, completely unaware that their world was about to be violently transformed. From the moment he could walk, Kunta learned the ways of the land. He ran barefoot through the fields, listened to the birds, and learned to distinguish the signs of the seasons, which dictated the cycles of planting and harvesting. The village elders taught him that every action carried meaning, every ritual held significance, and every choice reflected the legacy of the generations before him. He was trained to respect the spirits of the land and river, the invisible guardians that protected the village and its people. There was a profound sense of belonging in every task, whether helping to fish along the Gambia River or learning to hunt in the surrounding forests. Every step of his upbringing was a lesson in resilience, patience, and honor. Kunta's education extended beyond the practical skills of survival. He was immersed in oral tradition, memorizing the stories, proverbs, and histories of his people. His mind absorbed tales of heroes and warriors, of cunning and courage, of love and betrayal. He learned that identity was inseparable from memory and that the bond to one's ancestors was a source of strength that no enemy could sever. In these formative years, he began to understand the value of freedom not merely as the absence of chains, but as the ability to live fully within the framework of one's culture, to participate in the community, and to honor the rhythms and laws of the natural and spiritual world. The village of Juffure itself was a sanctuary of tradition, its houses built of mud and thatch, arranged in circular compounds where extended families lived together. The smoke of cooking fires mingled with the fragrance of freshly harvested crops, and the sounds of drums, laughter, and conversation created a constant background of life. Children played under the watchful eyes of elders, and Kunta, even at a young age, felt a sense of purpose and belonging. He was not merely a boy, he was a kinte, heir to a name and a lineage, a living vessel of history, carrying the pride and identity of his family into the future. Yet, even as Kunta thrived in his village, the wider world beyond Juffure carried dangers he could not yet imagine. The transatlantic slave trade had already begun to reach the coastal regions, and though inland villages like Juffure were relatively protected, the shadow of the traders and the violence they brought would soon penetrate even the most remote communities. For Kunta, the knowledge of this world beyond the river was abstract. It did not touch the soil beneath his feet or the laughter of his siblings. But the fragility of freedom is often invisible until it is snatched away. In this environment, Kunta's character was forged. He was strong, spirited, and curious, eager to learn and to test the boundaries of his physical and mental abilities. He wrestled with friends, ran long distances across the fields, and explored the forests near the river. Every experience built endurance and courage, but more. Importantly, he learned the discipline of patience and observation, lessons that would become crucial when the forces of slavery reached his village. From the elders he inherited not only practical skills but also a moral compass, a sense of justice, and a deep understanding of what it meant to live honorably. The innocence of Kunta's youth was intertwined with these lessons of identity and community. He did not yet know that the life he loved, the culture he revered, and the family that shaped him would soon be violently disrupted. Every game, every meal, every story shared around the evening fire carried a significance that would only become apparent in the years to come, when the memory of freedom would sustain him through unimaginable suffering. His connection to the land, to his family, and to the ancestral traditions of Juffure would become an anchor, a lifeline that no chains could sever. The origins of Kunta Kinte in Gambia represent more than a geographic fact. They signify the birth of a human spirit rooted in freedom, culture, and resilience. It is this foundation, this unshakable identity, that would define Kunta throughout the horrors of slavery, even as he would be torn from his homeland and subjected to unimaginable cruelty. The lessons, values, and memories of Juffure would survive within him, sustaining his courage and inspiring his resistance. The story of Kunta Kinte begins here, in a village where freedom, family, and identity were not abstract concepts but lived experiences, and where the heart of a boy who would never be fully conquered was first forged. Kunta Kinte's world in Juffure, Gambia, was one of laughter, learning, and the gentle rhythm of life in a free village. Yet, the fragile security of that world was about to be shattered in a single violent moment that would alter the course of his life forever. The year was 1767, and Kunta, a strong and spirited boy of approximately 16, was still deeply immersed in the traditions and teachings of his ancestors. He knew the names of the trees, the paths along the river, and the sacred chants that honored those who came before him. Every corner of his village was familiar, every face a source of comfort, every sound a part of the symphony of home. But beyond the river and the distant forests, the machinery of the transatlantic slave trade was moving relentlessly, indifferent to the innocence and freedom of children like Kunta. One morning, as the sun painted the village in golden light, a group of men appeared on the horizon. their movements deliberate and menacing. These were slave traders, armed with guns, knives, and the unyielding purpose of capturing human lives to sell into bondage. Kunta and his fellow villagers had heard rumors of such raids, whispered warnings carried by travelers and traders, but the reality was far more terrifying than any story. The men descended upon Jafur with terrifying speed and brutality, breaking the peace of the village with shouts, gunfire, and the chaos of sudden violence. Families screamed and scattered, trying desperately to protect their children, but the traders were methodical and merciless. Kunta's father, Omoro, tried to defend the village, rallying the men to resist, but the superior weaponry and the element of surprise left the defenders hopelessly outmatched. The village erupted into a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Smoke from burning huts filled the air, children's cries mingled with the shouts of adults, and the sound of breaking wood and snapping fences punctuated the chaos. In that moment, Kunta's world, which had once been safe and predictable, collapsed into a nightmare. He was seized by one of the traders, the iron grip of the man's hands clamping down on his arm with suffocating force. Resist. Tance was instinctual for Kunta. He struggled, kicked, and screamed, but against trained captors, his efforts were futile. Bound with rough ropes, Kunta was dragged from the village, his eyes catching the last glimpses of his home, his family, and the river that had been his playground and sanctuary. The reality of what had occurred was immediate and overwhelming. He was no longer a free boy in Jafur. He was now a prisoner, an object in the eyes of men who saw human life as a commodity. The terror was compounded by confusion. Why had this happened? How could the life he had known vanish so completely? Every step away from his village reinforced the finality of his capture. The journey to the coast, where the slave traders' ships awaited, was grueling. Kunta and others captured from nearby villages were marched for days over rough terrain, through forests and rivers, under the relentless sun, often with little food or water. The captives were treated with cruelty at every turn. Beatings were common, and those who faltered or tried to escape were punished harshly, sometimes fatally. During these marches, Kunta witnessed the fates of others. People who had tried to resist, who had collapsed from exhaustion, who had been shot or beaten beyond recognition. The experience was designed not only to physically subdue the captives, but to break their spirits, to convince them that resistance was futile. Kunta's youthful strength and knowledge of the land allowed him to survive, but the psychological impact was profound. The terror of the unknown, the separation from his family, and the constant threat of death pressed on him like a relentless weight. Yet even amid this horror, the foundations of his identity, taught by his family and village, provided a source of inner strength. He remembered the lessons of resilience, the stories of courage, and the songs of his ancestors cling to these memories as a form of quiet defiance. Though bound and beaten, the spirit of Kunta Kinte remained unbroken, rooted in the identity that no trader's chains could erase. By the time Kunta reached the coastal fort where captives were held before the transatlantic voyage, he was exhausted, starving, and traumatized. The fort itself was a place of terror, a gaunt, fortified structure where hundreds of men, women, and children were confined in small, dark cells, awaiting the ships that would carry them across the Atlantic. Conditions were horrific. The air was thick with filth, disease spread rapidly, and the captives were subjected to dehumanizing treatment by guards who saw them as property rather than human beings. Kunta had already endured the destruction of his village, the loss of his family, and the brutal march to the coast, yet this new stage of captivity introduced a more pervasive and relentless form of fear. In the fort, Kunta met other captives from across West Africa. Each face carried its own story of loss, and each cry echoed the despair of lives torn apart. These encounters were a grim reminder that the violence inflicted upon him was part of a larger system, a trade network that spanned continents designed to strip Africans of identity, family, and freedom. Despite the shared suffering, Kunta maintained his defiance. He refused to abandon his name, his memories, or his connection to Jafur, even as the traders attempted to force submission and obedience. The resistance of spirit, though invisible to the captors, became his shield, a silent assertion that though his body could be imprisoned, his soul could not. The kidnapping and capture of Kunta Kinte were not just a personal tragedy, they were emblematic of the horrors experienced by millions of Africans during the transatlantic slave trade. His story captures the violence, the terror, and the systematic dehumanization that defined this era. Yet it also captures something more enduring, the resilience of a young boy whose roots in freedom, community, and identity allowed him to endure what should have been unimaginable. Kunta Kinte's capture was the beginning of a journey that would take him across oceans, through unimaginable suffering, and into a world that sought to erase him. But in that early trauma, the first spark of resistance was ignited, a spark that would continue to burn throughout his life and echo through generations. The moment Kunta Kinte was forced aboard the slave ship, the weight of his reality pressed down upon him like a suffocating fog. The smell hit him first, a pungent, choking mixture of salt, sweat, and human excrement that seemed to seep into his very lungs. The ship's deck was a scene of chaos and cruelty, its wooden planks slick with filth, the air heavy with fear and despair. Kunta's captors shoved him into the dark, narrow hold below deck, joining hundreds of others who had been torn from villages across West Africa. The stench was overwhelming, and the air was so thick that each breath felt like it could strangle him. Men, women, and children were crammed together with barely enough space to sit or lie down, let alone stretch their limbs. Chains bit into wrists and ankles, binding bodies so tightly that comfort was impossible. The journey ahead, known as the Middle Passage, was a nightmare engineered to dehumanize and break the spirit. Kunta could hear the moans, screams, and cries of those around him, sounds that etched themselves into his memory and would haunt him for the rest of his life. Disease spread rapidly in the overcrowded hold. Dysentery, smallpox, and scurvy claimed lives daily. The traders, indifferent to human suffering, would throw those who died overboard without ceremony, their bodies vanishing into the depths of the ocean. Hunger gnawed relentlessly, and the food provided was minimal and often spoiled. Water was rationed, contaminated, and insufficient, leaving the captives weak and delirious. Kunta clung to life, even as he watched others succumb, their faces frozen in pain and fear. Physical abuse was constant. Anyone who resisted or showed signs of despair was beaten mercilessly. Kunta witnessed the cruelty firsthand, people whipped for crying, for speaking, or for attempting escape. The sounds of punishment echoed through the hold, a relentless drumbeat of suffering. He learned quickly that submission was necessary to survive, yet he refused to surrender his mind, his identity, or the memory of his homeland. In moments of fleeting darkness, he whispered the names of his family, recalled the riverbanks of Jufure, and recited the chants his mother had taught him. These memories became armor against despair, fragile yet vital threads that tethered him to the world he had lost. The sea itself seemed to conspire against them. Storms battered the ship with relentless fury, waves crashing over the deck, soaking the captives below and making already cramped and filthy quarters almost unlivable. The constant rocking of the vessel caused nausea, weakness, and despair. Kunta had to fight not only for his life, but also for the fragments of sanity that kept him human. In the darkness, he listened to the sobs and prayers of his fellow captives, and sometimes shared whispered words of encouragement, small acts of solidarity that reminded them that they were more than cargo, they were human beings. Sleep was nearly impossible. The cramped position forced on Kunta caused relentless pain in his back and limbs. Disease and hunger left him perpetually weak, but exhaustion could not silence the terror of captivity. He could feel the psychological grip of the traders who sought to reduce every person aboard to mere property, stripping away names, heritage, and identity. Even in the midst of unimaginable suffering, Kunta clung to his name, repeating it silently to himself, a mantra of resistance that affirmed who he was and where he came from. Kunta's mind often wandered to escape, imagining the riverbanks of Jufure, the forested paths he had known, and the warm embrace of his mother. These visions were both solace and torment, a reminder of what had been lost and a spark that refused to be extinguished. But the reality of the ship was relentless, escape was impossible, and resistance was met with immediate and brutal punishment. Yet even in submission, Kunta's spirit remained defiantly alive. He resisted in thought, memory, and quiet rebellion, refusing to allow the traders to completely erase him. The Middle Passage also exposed Kunta to the shared suffering of his fellow captives, people of diverse origins and cultures, all forced into the same unbearable conditions. Bonds formed in whispers and subtle gestures, fleeting connections that reminded him that even in despair, the human spirit sought connection and solidarity. Sometimes they sang in secret, recalling songs from their homelands, melodies that crossed the darkness and the stench of the hold, brief affirmations of memory and resistance. These small acts of cultural preservation were tiny acts of defiance, asserting humanity in a world determined to deny it. Kunta's survival through the Middle Passage was a testament to endurance, resilience, and the power of memory. Every day spent in the hold was a confrontation with death, disease, and despair. Every act of breathing, of remembering, and of resisting was an assertion that he would not be wholly broken. The journey was designed to annihilate identity, but Kunta's connection to Jafur, to his family, and to the traditions of people provided a lifeline, a tether to a past that the traitors could not erase. In his mind, he remained a son, a Kinte, a free boy from Gambia, even as his body was treated as property. By the time the ship reached the American colonies, many of the captives had perished, and those who survived were forever scarred, physically and emotionally. Kunta emerged from the hold weakened and disoriented, but his spirit remained resilient. The horrors of the Middle Passage had forged in him a strength born not of submission, but of memory, identity, and the will to resist. He carried with him the knowledge that the chains placed upon his body could not bind his soul, that the traitors could take his freedom, but could not erase the essence of who he was. The Middle Passage was more than a journey. It was a crucible that tested the limits of human endurance and cruelty. Kunta Kinte's survival was remarkable, but it was also a quiet declaration. No matter the brutality inflicted, his identity, memories, and spirit could not be extinguished. It was the first act of resistance in a life that would continually confront oppression, a testament to the resilience of the human soul in the face of systematic dehumanization. Through every wave, every scream, and every moment of despair, Kunta clung to the boy from Jafur he had once been, carrying his heritage across an ocean and into a world that sought to erase it. When Kunta Kinte finally set foot on American soil, the world he entered was foreign, hostile, and designed to strip him of everything he had ever known. The ship disgorged its human cargo at a port in Annapolis, Maryland, a bustling center of commerce where the transatlantic slave trade had firmly taken root. Kunta, weakened from the harrowing Middle Passage, stumbled onto the docks, chains biting into his wrists and ankles. Around him, the air smelled of salt, tar, the sweat of laborers, mingled with the cries of other newly captured Africans. The sun was blinding, but even its warmth could not comfort him. For the first time, he truly realized the scale of what had been done to him. He was no longer a boy from Jafur. He was a commodity, a human being reduced to a price tag in the eyes of strangers. The first people he encountered were not welcoming. Traders pushed him and the other captives onto the auction block with little regard for their humanity. Families were torn apart, mothers screamed as their children were separated, husbands and wives wrenched from each other's arms. Kunta's heart pounded as he was examined by buyers who scrutinized him as one might inspect livestock. He was measured, prodded, and mocked, his defiance met with scorn and threats. When a planter finally purchased him, Kunta became property of a household whose power over him was absolute. His identity, his freedom, and his past had been stripped away in a single merciless transaction. The plantation where Kunta was taken was vast and unyielding, a world of brick buildings, tobacco fields, and laborers whose lives were governed by the whip, the overseer, and the master's will. Kunta's new reality was one of constant labor. From dawn until dusk, he was forced to work in the fields, his young body pushed to its limits by men who had no interest in his health or well-being. The sun scorched his back, and the soil scraped his hands raw. But even as fatigue threatened to break him, Kunta's mind clung to the memory of Jafur. Every seed he planted, every row he hoed was done under the shadow of chains, but within him, a spark of resistance, rooted in memory and identity, remained unextinguished. Life under enslavement was not only physically punishing, but psychologically torturous. Kunta was forced to adopt a new name, a cruel attempt to sever his connection to Africa and erase his heritage. He was given rules and expectations that were alien, and any act of disobedience was met with harsh punishment. The overseers were relentless, using fear and violence to maintain control. Flogging, beatings, and threats of death were routine. Kunta endured these horrors with the stoicism of someone who had already survived unimaginable suffering. Yet each day reminded him that the world he had entered was one in which human life could be bought, sold, and discarded at whim. Even in this oppression, Kunta resisted in subtle but meaningful ways. He refused to abandon his name entirely, murmuring it silently to himself when no one could hear. He remembered the songs of his mother and the chants of the village elders, teaching them quietly to fellow captives when possible. These acts, though small, were profound. They were defiance in its purest form, a refusal to let the oppressors erase his memory, his culture, and his sense of self. Every whisper of a song, every recollection of his homeland, was a rebellion against the system that sought to annihilate him. Kunta's interactions with other enslaved Africans revealed the profound human cost of the institution. He witnessed the way families were torn apart, children separated from parents, and communities fractured. The shared suffering fostered bonds of solidarity and resilience. Even in the harshest conditions, Kunta and others exchanged stories of their homes, taught each other words from their native languages, and preserved fragments of culture that the masters could not fully extinguish. These connections were vital, offering emotional sustenance in a life that was otherwise designed to crush hope. The plantation also revealed the stark hierarchy and cruelty of the enslaved society itself. Those who worked the hardest, those who resisted the most, were punished not only physically, but socially, isolated and shamed to prevent rebellion. Kunta quickly understood that survival required a delicate balance, endurance of labor, strategic submission, and quiet resistance. He could not fight openly, but he could retain his memory, his dignity, and his identity, and these became weapons against the total domination imposed upon him. Kunta's spirit was tested in other ways as well. The psychological trauma of witnessing brutality against others, the despair of those around him, and the constant threat of violence weighed heavily on him. Yet he never fully succumbed to despair. His memories of Jafur, his family, and the rituals of his youth provided him with a private refuge. These recollections became a lifeline, a source of strength that no whip or chain could erase. Even as the plantation sought to remold him into a compliant servant, Kunta maintained the core of who he was, a free boy from Gambia whose identity could not be stolen. Over time, Kunta began to understand the power dynamics of the plantation. He observed the rhythms of labor, the patterns of punishment, and the vulnerabilities of his masters and overseers. Though he was still young, he internalized lessons that would allow him to endure and survive. Every day was a negotiation between submission and resistance, endurance and rebellion, survival and memory. The plantation was a crucible that tested not only physical strength, but the resilience of the human spirit. And Kunta faced these tests with the knowledge that freedom could never truly be taken from the mind and heart. The arrival and enslavement of Kunta Kinte in America marked the beginning of a new chapter of suffering, yet it was also the stage upon which his resilience would shine. His body was bound, his freedom denied, and his culture targeted for erasure, but within him lived the unbreakable memory of Jafur and the traditions that had shaped him. Enslavement in America was more than a physical condition, it was a psychological and cultural war, and Kunta's survival depended on his ability to navigate it while preserving the essence of who he was. His defiance, though quiet, was profound. It was a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, identity, memory, and dignity could survive, carrying the hope of eventual liberation forward through time and generations. Even as Kunta Kinte labored under the relentless sun of the Maryland plantation, bending over rows of tobacco and enduring the ceaseless oversight of masters and overseers, his mind remained unyielding. The chains that bound his wrists and ankles could control his body, but they could not conquer his spirit. Deep within him lived the memory of Jafur, the riverbanks where he had played as a boy, the songs his mother had taught him, the wisdom of the elders, and the pride of being a Kinte. These memories became more than recollections. They were acts of resistance, invisible but potent, forming a private realm of freedom that the plantation's cruelty could never invade. From the very first days on the plantation, Kunta refused to submit fully to the erasure of his identity. When his captors attempted to force him to take a new name, to abandon Kunta Kinte in favor of a foreign designation, he resisted. He would whisper his name in the quiet hours before dawn, repeating it like a mantra, a talisman against the erasure of his heritage. In those whispered syllables lay defiance, a refusal to let the men who had stolen him dictate the terms of his existence. Though outwardly obedient when necessary to survive, inwardly he remained the boy of Jofur, tethered to a lineage and a culture that no whip could annihilate. Resistance, however, was never only internal. Kunta's spirit demanded action, and he found subtle ways to assert his identity, despite the ever-present risk of punishment. He observed and mimicked African customs, teaching fragments of his language and songs to the few fellow captives who were from neighboring regions. These acts were small but profound. They allowed culture to survive within the oppressive environment of slavery, creating a network of shared memory and quiet rebellion. Each song sung softly beneath the moon, each word of his native tongue preserved, was an assertion that their identity, though threatened, could not be erased. Kunta also resisted by refusing to accept the moral authority of the plantation. He recognized the lies and hypocrisies of the enslavers, who claimed divine or natural justification for the brutality inflicted upon human beings. In silent observation, he memorized patterns of cruelty, learning how punishment was administered, which overseers were ruthless, and where subtle defiance could be tolerated. Every act of resistance, whether in thought, word, or minor action, was a claim to autonomy. He could not overturn the plantation's power, but he could assert the power of memory, pride, and culture over the daily attempts to crush his identity. Physical resistance was dangerous but often unavoidable. Kunta attempted to flee when opportunity arose, driven by the memory of freedom that had been violently taken from him. Though these attempts failed, resulting in brutal punishment, they were statements of refusal, proof that slavery could not fully dominate his will. Every act of defiance, every escape attempt, carried the echo of Jofur, reminding both Kunta and those who witnessed him that freedom was not merely a distant concept, but a right to be claimed, even in the face of overwhelming oppression. Kunta's resistance extended to the moral and spiritual sphere. He refused to internalize the narratives of inferiority imposed upon enslaved Africans. The plantation system sought to convince its victims that they were inherently lesser, that their culture, language, and heritage were worthless. Kunta rejected these lies. He held fast to the dignity instilled by his parents and elders, refusing to see himself as property in the mental sense. Even when he was treated as such in the physical world, this internal rebellion was as significant as any outward act, a defiance invisible yet invincible. The cultivation of identity amidst oppression also relied upon Kunta's ability to forge bonds with others. He shared stories of Africa, of his village, of customs that the traders and masters sought to erase. In these shared memories, enslaved Africans found solace, validation, and the courage to resist mentally and culturally. Kunta became a carrier of tradition, a living repository of heritage that threatened the plantation's goal of total domination. Through him, the culture of Jofur survived, seeding resilience in others and reinforcing the idea that slavery could not extinguish the human spirit. Even the punishment that came for resistance could not fully subdue him. Flogging, beatings, and humiliation were designed to instill fear, yet Kunta endured them with a defiance that was both quiet and profound. Pain became a reminder, not of defeat, but of survival. Every scar on his body told a story of endurance, each mark a testament to his refusal to allow enslavement to erase who he truly was. Where others may have been broken, Kunta preserved an inner sovereignty, a consciousness that remained fully his own despite the oppression surrounding. Kunta's resistance was also rooted in a deep understanding of the power of memory. He knew that identity depended upon remembering the riverbanks, the chants, the names, and the stories that defined him. He transmitted this memory to those around him, teaching children and fellow captives the songs and words of their homelands. By doing so, he preserved culture across generations, ensuring that the attempt to erase African identity would never be complete. Resistance and identity were inseparable. One could not exist without the other. Kunta's mind and heart remained a sanctuary, a space where slavery could not penetrate, where the traditions of Jofur thrived and promised continuity even in exile. In this way, Kunta Kinte's life on the plantation was defined by the delicate balance of survival and defiance. He complied outwardly when necessary to avoid death, but inwardly he nurtured the essence of who he was, a proud son of Gambia, a Kinte, unbroken and unbowed. Resistance was not merely a reaction to cruelty, it was a deliberate preservation of self, a refusal to allow the physical chains to dictate the boundaries of his mind and spirit. Every whispered song, every remembered chant, every secret retention of his heritage was an act of rebellion against a system designed to annihilate it. Through this defiance, Kunta Kinte became more than a captive. He became a symbol of resilience. He embodied the truth that identity cannot be stolen, that memory and culture can survive even under the harshest oppression, and that the human spirit can endure beyond the limits of physical suffering. His resistance was both a personal shield and a legacy for future generations, a reminder that even in the depths of enslavement, a soul can remain free. Resistance on the plantation was not without cost. For Kunta Kinte, asserting his identity, remembering Jafua, or attempting to escape often brought him into direct conflict with the unrelenting cruelty of the masters and overseers. The system of slavery was designed not only to extract labor, but to instill terror, to crush defiance, and to assert absolute control over every aspect of an enslaved person's life. Punishment was swift, brutal, and highly symbolic, demonstrating that no challenge to authority would be tolerated. For Kunta, these punishments were a visceral reminder of the stakes of resistance and the perilous tightrope. He had to walk between survival and the preservation of his spirit. One of the most harrowing incidents in Kunta's life was his attempted escape, an act that, though instinctual, had devastating consequences. Driven by the memory of freedom, by the longing for the riverbanks and forests of Jufur, Kunta took advantage of a momentary lapse in oversight and ran. He ran not just to escape the physical chains, but to reclaim the identity and autonomy that the plantations sought to obliterate. Yet the overseers were quick, relentless, and cruel. They captured him before he could reach the woods beyond the fields, dragging him back in chains, their anger and the promise of punishment palpable. The punishment meted out to Kunta was both physical and psychological, designed to make an example of him. He was beaten mercilessly with the whip, his back raw and bleeding, the skin broken and seared with pain that would remain as a lasting reminder of the cost of defiance. The blows were delivered in front of other enslaved people, a calculated act meant to instill fear and obedience. Each strike was not only a punishment of his body, but an attack on his spirit, a tangible manifestation of the plantation's attempt to assert dominance over every facet of his being. Yet, even as he screamed and bled, Kunta's mind clung to the memory of freedom, to his family in Jufur, and to the knowledge that his identity could not be taken by force. Perhaps the most infamous and symbolic punishment Kunta endured was the amputation of part of his foot, a punishment that reflected the extreme cruelty of the slave system and its determination to physically and psychologically break individuals. After yet another escape attempt, he was captured and subjected to this horrific act. The overseer's rationale was brutally simple. A crippled slave would be less likely to run again, and the spectacle of mutilation would terrorize others into submission. The pain was unimaginable, but the psychological horror cut even deeper. Kunta faced the reality that his body, which had carried him across continents, through the Middle Passage and into enslavement, could now be permanently marked and weakened to enforce obedience. Despite this mutilation, Kunta's spirit did not yield. In the aftermath of the punishment, he experienced not only physical suffering, but also the emotional torment of humiliation and despair. Yet in quiet moments he drew strength from the lessons of his upbringing in Jafur, from the stories of resilience and courage passed down through his family, and from the enduring memory of freedom. The act of resistance, even at such a cost, became a badge of survival rather than defeat. He had attempted to reclaim autonomy, and though the system had inflicted unspeakable pain, it had not conquered the core of his being. The punishments also served to highlight the systemic cruelty of slavery itself. Every act of violence, mutilation, or humiliation was a calculated reinforcement of a system built on fear, designed to ensure that enslaved Africans understood their supposed inferiority and absolute lack of agency. The overseers and masters wielded these punishments not only to control labor, but to obliterate identity, culture, and memory. Kunta's suffering, therefore, was emblematic of the broader human cost of slavery, a daily confrontation with the machinery of oppression and an unrelenting struggle to preserve one's humanity in the face of calculated dehumanization. Kunta's endurance of punishment was intertwined with subtle acts of defiance. Even when subjected to physical torment, he maintained his identity in thought and memory, whispering the names of his family, recounting the stories of Jafur, and refusing to fully submit mentally to the system. Each moment of defiance, however small or internal, was an assertion of sovereignty over his mind and spirit. Where the plantation sought to reduce him to property, Kunta maintained his personhood, carrying the essence of his culture and lineage despite the cruelty inflicted upon his body. The psychological impact of punishment and mutilation extended beyond Kunta himself. Other enslaved people witnessed his suffering, and while it was intended to terrorize, it also demonstrated the unbreakable resolve of those who resisted. Kunta's courage in enduring pain without surrendering his inner identity inspired quiet admiration and hope among others, planting seeds of resistance and the recognition that the human spirit could endure even under unimaginable cruelty. The punishments that sought to annihilate his will instead underscored the depth of his resilience. Even as he healed from physical injuries, the memories of pain remained etched in Kunta's body and mind. Yet the scars were transformed into symbols of endurance, reminders that his spirit had survived attempts at total domination. Each scar, each memory of torment, became part of his narrative, a testament to the capacity for resilience and defiance, even in the darkest circumstances. In enduring punishment and mutilation, Kunta Kinte embodied the duality of slavery, the absolute cruelty of a system designed to destroy, and the extraordinary capacity of the human spirit to resist, survive, and preserve identity. The lessons of punishment and suffering shaped Kunta's subsequent actions. He learned caution and strategy, understanding when to resist overtly and when to preserve strength for subtle mental forms of defiance. The physical pain never diminished the flame of memory, identity, or hope that burned within him. Kunta's story of suffering, endurance, and defiance illustrates the brutal mechanisms of slavery and the remarkable resilience required to survive them, showing that even when the body is broken, the human spirit can remain defiantly unbroken. If punishment was the physical weapon of slavery, family separation was its deepest psychological cruelty. For Kunta Kinte, the loss of freedom had already torn him from his parents, his siblings, and the village that defined his existence. Yet slavery did not end its violence with that first rupture. In America, separation became routine, deliberate, and devastating, a system designed to prevent emotional bonds from becoming sources of strength. On the plantation, love itself was treated as a threat, something to be fractured, controlled, or destroyed, whenever it became inconvenient to those in power. Kunta quickly learned that enslaved people were never allowed to believe that their relationships were permanent. Husbands and wives lived with the constant fear that a sale, a debt, or a master's whim could tear them apart overnight. Children were born into uncertainty, knowing that their parents could disappear without warning. The plantation appeared stable on the surface, but beneath it lay a constant instability that poisoned every bond. Kunta watched mothers cling to their children with desperate intensity, knowing that each embrace might be the last. He saw fathers teach their sons quietly, hurriedly, as though racing against an invisible clock that could strike at any moment. For Kunta, family separation reopened the wound left by his capture in Jafur. Each time he witnessed a child being pulled from a parent's arms, the memory of his own mother's returned with unbearable clarity. The plantation echoed with cries that sounded eerily like those he had heard the day he was stolen, voices filled with terror, disbelief, and grief. Slavery did not merely enslave bodies, it dismantled families with surgical precision, leaving scars that stretched across generations. Kunta's own attempts to form familial bonds were shadowed by this reality. Love existed, but it was fragile, always vulnerable to destruction. He understood that attachment brought comfort but also pain, and yet he could not abandon the human need for connection. In quiet moments, enslaved people formed families not through legal recognition, but through shared suffering, mutual care, and emotional survival. These bonds were acts of resistance, declarations that even in bondage, they were still human, still capable of love, still deserving of connection. The masters understood this power and sought to control it. Families were separated deliberately to punish resistance, discourage rebellion, or settle financial disputes. A child could be sold to another plantation miles away, A spouse could vanish in the blink of an eye. Kunta saw men return from the fields only to find their wives gone, sold without warning. He saw children stare blankly into space, too young to understand why their parents never returned. These moments inflicted wounds deeper than any whip, wounds that bled silently, endlessly, and invisibly. For Kunta, the loss of African family was compounded by the threat of losing any new family he might build. He carried within him the memory of lineage, of ancestors whose names he still whispered, whose stories he still remembered. Slavery tried to sever that continuity, to turn each generation into an isolated fragment without past or future. But Kunta resisted this erasure through memory. He spoke of Africa, of family, of traditions, plantain, seeds of identity in the minds of younger enslaved people. In doing so, he reconstructed family not through blood alone but through shared remembrance and cultural survival. Children, in particular, became vessels of hope and grief. Kunta observed how they were forced into labor at an early age, denied childhood, and taught obedience through fear. Yet even in this environment, elders passed down stories quietly, often at night, when the plantation slept. These whispered lessons were acts of defiance. They taught children that they came from somewhere, that they belonged to a history larger than the plantation, that they were not born slaves but born human. In this way, family survived not as an institution sanctioned by law, but as a living memory passed from voice to voice. The cruelty of separation revealed the moral bankruptcy of the slave system. Masters who claimed ownership over human lives spoke of property rights while ignoring the devastation inflicted on families. Kunta recognized this hypocrisy clearly. He saw how enslavers preached morality and religion while violating the most fundamental human bonds. This awareness deepened his resistance, strengthening his resolve to preserve identity, memory, and dignity even when family ties were constantly under attack. Family separation also created a unique form of grief, one without closure. There were no funerals, no confirmations of death, only absence. Loved ones vanished, leaving behind unanswered questions and unending hope that perhaps somewhere they still lived. This uncertainty haunted the enslaved, including Kunta, whose parents in Africa remained frozen in time within his memory. He did not know if they lived or died, only that they existed forever in his heart, unchanged, unreachable, and painfully real. Yet despite this cruelty, family endured in altered forms. Enslaved people became parents to children not their own, siblings to strangers, and elders to entire communities. Kunta became part of this collective kinship, offering guidance, memory, and cultural grounding. Through him, fragments of African identity survived, binding people together across losses and separations. Family became less about proximity and permanence, and more about care, memory, and shared humanity. In the end, slavery failed to erase family entirely. It fractured it, wounded it, and reshaped it, but it could not destroy the instinct to love, protect, and remember. For Kunta Kinte, family separation was one of the deepest torments of enslavement, yet it also revealed the extraordinary resilience of the human heart. Even when torn apart repeatedly, people rebuilt connection from the ashes of loss. Through memory, storytelling, and shared endurance, family survived. Not as the enslavers defined it, but as the enslaved reclaimed it. This survival of family, fragile yet persistent, became a quiet rebellion against a system designed to reduce people to isolated, controllable units. In preserving connection despite separation, Kunta and others affirmed a truth slavery could never extinguish: that humanity, once awakened, refuses to be fully destroyed. When slavery sought to erase names, languages, and histories, memory became the final battlefield. For Kunta Kinte, survival was no longer only about enduring pain or preserving identity within himself, it became about transmission. What could not be written had to be spoken. What could not be protected by law had to be guarded by memory. In a world where enslaved people were denied education and forbidden from recording their past, oral tradition became the most powerful weapon against erasure. Through voice, story, and repetition, Kunta ensured that his life before captivity did not die with him. From his earliest days on the plantation, Kunta understood the danger of forgetting. He had seen how newly arrived Africans, stripped of language and isolated from those who shared their tongue, slowly lost the ability to remember who they had been. Names faded, customs blurred, and eventually even the memory of Africa became indistinct. Kunta refused to let this happen. He repeated his name often, silently and aloud when possible, anchoring himself to it. But more importantly, he began to speak, to children, to fellow enslaved people, to anyone who would listen in moments of safety. He spoke of Jufuur, of the Gambia River, of his father Omoro, of his mother Binta, of village rituals, seasons, and stories. Every word spoken was an act of defiance. Night became the safest time for memory. When the fields were quiet and overseers retreated, enslaved people gathered in hushed circles. In these moments, Kunta's voice carried weight. He did not speak like a man guessing at the past, he spoke like a witness. His memories were precise, vivid, alive. He described Africa not as a myth, but as a place of structure, dignity, and freedom. For children born into slavery, these stories shattered the lie that bondage was natural or eternal. They learned that their ancestors had lived full lives before chains, that they came from societies with laws, families, and honor. This knowledge reshaped how they saw themselves. The oral legacy was not simply storytelling, it was education. Kunta taught through repetition, knowing that memory weakens without reinforcement. He corrected details, insisted on names, and emphasized lineage. He explained how ancestry mattered, how knowing who came before gave strength to endure what came next. In doing so, he transformed personal memory into collective inheritance. His past became a shared possession, something that could not be confiscated or sold. Slavery attempted to isolate generation, but oral tradition bridged them. Children learned not only stories but values, respect for elders, courage in suffering, and the sacredness of identity. Kunta emphasized that even when enslaved bodies were controlled, the mind remained sovereign. These lessons shaped behavior, resilience, and resistance. They did not always result in rebellion, but they prevented submission of the soul. The power of oral legacy lay in its adaptability. Stories changed slightly with each retelling, shaped by context and audience, but their core endured. Kunta's name, his birthplace, his capture, and his refusal to forget Africa remained intact. Memory survived not because it was static, but because it lived, breathed, and moved through people. Each retelling strengthened it. Each listener became a future teller. The enslavers underestimated this force. They believed control of the body meant control of the person. They banned African languages, punished storytelling, and tried to sever generational continuity. Yet they could not silence whispers, nor could they extinguish memory carried in rhythm, song, and story. Oral tradition slipped through cracks in surveillance. It traveled through lullabies, work songs, and coded language. Even when spoken softly, it echoed loudly across time. As Kunta aged, his body bore the marks of slavery, but his voice gained authority. Younger generations looked to him not merely as an elder, but as a living bridge to a stolen world. His memories became proof that slavery was imposed, not inherited. This distinction mattered deeply. It preserved dignity. It reminded listeners that bondage was a condition, not an identity. The oral legacy also carried grief. Kunta did not hide pain or loss. He spoke of family taken, of freedom destroyed, of wounds that never healed. In doing so, he validated the suffering of others. Pain, when shared, became survivable. Memory allowed grief to exist without surrender. It transformed trauma into testimony. Long after Kunta's body weakened, his words continued to travel. Children repeated his stories to their children. Names were preserved even when bloodlines were disrupted. Africa lived on in fragments of language, rhythm, and memory. What began as one man's refusal to forget became a generational inheritance. Oral legacy was not passive remembrance. It was resistance across time. It ensured that slavery would not have the final word. Even when history books ignored the enslaved, even when official records reduced lives to property, memory endured. Kunta's story did not survive because it was written down early. It survived because people believed it mattered enough to remember accurately, to protect fiercely, and to pass on faithfully. In this way, Kunta Kinte outlived slavery itself. His life became more than an individual struggle. It became a narrative carried forward by descendants who understood that remembering was an obligation. Oral legacy turned survival into purpose. It transformed suffering into continuity. And it ensured that a boy born free in Africa would never be erased, even by a system designed to make forgetting inevitable. Long after the chains rusted and the plantations fell silent, the meaning of Kunta Kinte's life continued to grow. What began as one man's struggle to remember who he was became something far larger, a symbol of identity reclaimed, history restored, and dignity defended against centuries of erasure. Kunta's cultural significance did not emerge from power or privilege, it emerged from endurance. His refusal to get Africa to abandon his name, or to accept the lie that slavery defined him, transformed his life into a beacon for generations searching for their roots. For descendants of the enslaved, Kunta represented something revolutionary, a traceable beginning. Slavery had severed family lines so completely that many African Americans were taught to believe their history began on plantations. Kunta's story challenged that void. He stood as proof that Black history did not begin in bondage, but in villages, families, cultures, and nations across Africa. His remembered birthplace, his parents' names, and his language became acts of historical restoration, reconnecting people to a past that slavery tried to erase. Culturally, Kunta Kinte became a symbol of resistance, not through violence, but through memory. In a society that demanded assimilation and silence, he represented defiance through identity. His insistence on his name alone carried enormous weight. Names defined belonging, lineage, and selfhood. Slavery's practice of renaming was an attempt at domination, and Kunta's rejection of it became a cultural statement. Identity could be oppressed but not owned. This idea resonated deeply across generations who struggled against systems that sought to define them from the outside. Kunta's significance also reshaped how history itself was understood. For a long time, the enslaved were depicted as voiceless victims, passive subjects of cruelty rather than active bearers of culture and memory. Kunta's story disrupted that narrative. He was not silent, he remembered, he taught, he resisted. His life reframed enslaved Africans not as people without history, but as people whose history survived, despite deliberate attempts to destroy it. This shift altered how slavery was discussed, studied, and understood, not just as an economic system, but as a cultural and psychological war against identity. The emotional power of Kunta's story lay in its humanity. He was not a distant symbol, he was a son, a brother, a father, a man who loved his homeland and mourned its loss. His pain was personal, and that intimacy made his story universal. People across cultures recognized in him the longing for home, the need for belonging, and the refusal to surrender dignity. His life transcended geography and race, becoming a global symbol of what happens when humanity is denied and how it fights back. Kunta's cultural impact also extended into how descendants understood themselves. Knowing that an ancestor had lived free, spoke a native language, practiced traditions, and carried values reshaped identity. It countered internalized narratives of inferiority. It replaced shame with pride. Africa was no longer an abstract concept or a distant mystery. It became a real place connected by blood, memory, and story. This reconnection empowered individuals to reclaim traditions, explore heritage, and rebuild cultural continuity fractured by slavery. Even beyond genealogy, Kunta's story influenced broader conversations about justice, memory, and truth. It forced societies to confront uncomfortable realities about violence, exploitation, and the long-term consequences of dehumanization. Cultural significance in this sense meant accountability. Remembering Kunta meant acknowledging what was done to millions like him. It challenged sanitized histories and demanded honesty, insisting that progress could not be built on forgetting. Kunta's life also became a symbol of cultural survival. Music, language patterns, storytelling traditions, and values carried by enslaved Africans did not vanish, they evolved. His story highlighted how African culture persisted in new forms, shaping spirituals, folklore, and communal traditions. These were not remnants of loss, but evidence of adaptation and strength. Kunta represented continuity, the idea that culture bends but does not break, even under extreme oppression. Importantly, Kunta's significance was not rooted in perfection or heroism as traditionally defined. He suffered. He failed to escape. He endured punishment. Yet it was precisely this realism that made his story powerful. Cultural icons are often mythologized beyond humanity. Kunta remained deeply human. His endurance made resistance accessible, showing that survival itself could be an act of defiance. As time passed, Kunta Kinte became more than an ancestor, he became a reference point, a way to say, we remember, we came from somewhere, we are not what slavery tried to make us. His name became shorthand for ancestral memory, cultural pride, and the refusal to be erased. In speaking his name, people reclaimed the right to define themselves through their own history rather than through imposed narratives. Cultural significance is measured not only by fame, but by impact. Kunta Kinte's life reshaped identity, restored historical continuity, and affirmed the power of memory over oppression. He stood as proof that even when a system is designed to erase everything, names, families, languages, it can fail. Through one man's refusal to forget, millions found a way to remember. There are truths that nations bury not because they are unknown, but because they are unbearable. Kunta Kinte's life exposes one of those truths, a reality so raw and morally devastating that generations attempted to soften it, sanitize it, or erase it altogether. His story stands in direct opposition to the comforting myths that portrayed slavery as civilizing, necessary, or benign. It reveals slavery as it truly was, a system built on terror, theft of humanity, and calculated cruelty. America's forgotten truth is not that slavery existed, but that it was lived daily by real people with names, families, cultures, and memories that refused to disappear. Kunta's life dismantles the illusion that slavery was merely an unfortunate chapter in progress. His capture, mutilation, and enforced silence were not accidents of history. They were the deliberate mechanisms of a system that depended on dehumanization to survive. The brutality inflicted on him was not the excess of a few cruel individuals, it was policy, enforced through law, economics, and social acceptance. Remembering Kunta means confronting the fact that the foundations of wealth, power, and national growth were laid upon broken bodies and stolen lives. For generations, the enslaved were described as statistics, labor units, or anonymous masses. This abstraction made forgetting easier. Kunta Kinte disrupts that distance. He had a birthplace, a language, a father and mother whose names he remembered, and a life that did not begin in chains. His story restores individuality to the millions who were reduced to numbers. It demands recognition that slavery was not an impersonal institution, but an intimate violation repeated every day, in fields, homes, auction blocks, and whipping posts. America's discomfort with this truth explains why stories like Kunta's were marginalized for so long. They complicate national narratives of freedom, liberty, and moral progress. They expose contradictions between ideals and actions. It is easier to celebrate independence while ignoring those excluded from it, easier to praise democracy while denying its benefits to an entire population. Kunta's life forces a reckoning. Freedom proclaimed for some was built upon the unfreedom of others. The erasure extended beyond history books. It entered language, education, and memory itself. Enslaved people were taught to forget, descendants were taught not to ask, and society learned to look away. This forgetting was not passive, it was intentional. Silence protected power. Acknowledgement threatened it. Kunta's story survived not because it was welcomed, but because memory refused to obey erasure. America's forgotten truth is also about legacy. Slavery did not end neatly. Its consequences did not vanish with emancipation. Trauma, displacement, and inequality carried forward, shaping lives long after chains were removed. Kunta's descendants inherited not only his name, but the weight of history, the knowledge that survival itself was an achievement, and that remembering was a responsibility. His story exposes how the past remains present, how historical violence echoes across generations. Confronting this truth is uncomfortable because it demands accountability, not guilt, but honesty. It requires acknowledging that greatness and cruelty coexisted, that progress was uneven and often built upon injustice. Kunta's life does not ask for pity. It asks for recognition. It insists that the enslaved were not passive recipients of suffering, but active bearers of culture, resistance, and memory. There is also a deeper truth revealed through Kunta's endurance, that the attempt to erase humanity ultimately failed. Slavery sought to destroy identity, yet identity survived. It tried to silence voices, yet stories endured. The very existence of Kunta's remembered life is proof that oppression, no matter how absolute it appears, cannot fully extinguish the human will to remember, resist, and define itself. America's forgotten truth is therefore not only about cruelty, it is also about resilience. Kunta represents both. He embodies the violence of a system and the refusal of the human spirit to surrender entirely. Remembering him means holding both realities at once, resisting the urge to simplify history into heroes and villains, while ignoring the suffering in between. Telling Kunta's story today matters because forgetting always serves injustice. When histories are erased, systems repeat themselves in new forms. Memory becomes protection, truth becomes resistance. Kunta's life reminds us that progress without remembrance is hollow, and freedom without honesty is incomplete. To remember Kunta Kinte is to reject comforting myths and accept difficult truths. It is to acknowledge that the nation's past includes voices long silenced but never gone. His story stands as a warning against erasure and a demand for truth, a reminder that history does not disappear when ignored, and that the cost of forgetting is paid by those whose humanity is denied again and again. In speaking his name, in telling his life fully and without dilution, America confronts what it once tried to hide. And in that confrontation lies the possibility not of erasing the past, but of finally facing it. Kunta Kinte's story does not end with chains, nor does it belong only to the past. It lives in memory, in identity, and in the unanswered questions history tried to silence. His life exposes the raw truth behind slavery, not as a distant institution, but as a human catastrophe experienced by real people with names, families, and futures stolen by force. Remembering Kunta Kinte is not an act of nostalgia, it is an act of resistance against forgetting. This story matters because forgetting has always served injustice. When suffering is buried, it repeats. When voices are erased, power remains unchallenged. Kunta's refusal to forget who he was, even when beaten, mutilated, and renamed, stands as a timeless lesson. Oppression can control bodies, but it cannot own memory, dignity, or truth. His life reminds us that history is not only written by the powerful, but preserved by those who refuse to let their humanity be erased. In a world still grappling with inequality, displacement, and historical denial, Kunta Kinte's journey forces an uncomfortable but necessary reckoning. It asks us to look beyond sanitized narratives and confront the foundations on which modern societies were built. Not to assign blame, but to demand honesty. Not to reopen wounds, but to understand why they never fully healed. Kunta's legacy is proof that identity survives even the most violent attempts at erasure. That culture adapts. That memory outlives chains. His story is not just African history or American history, it is human history. And as long as it is told truthfully, it protects future generations from repeating the lies that once justified unimaginable cruelty. To remember Kunta Kinte is to honor millions who never had their names recorded, whose stories were lost to silence. It is to say that their lives mattered, that their suffering was real, and that their humanity was never truly conquered. History does not change when it is forgotten. It changes only when it is faced, and Kunta Kinte demands that we face it,